One of the things we often talk a big game about, but don't often see in reality, in the miniature painting space are unique ideas. Now, before you type up a comment showing how Warhammer has provided that niche for quite a long time, and that it is still continuing to do so, I would like to say, just no. In all honesty, something that has been the case of Games Workshop properties and the factions they produce is the fact that a faction will get one or two unique elements and then just recycles old ideas from existing properties. The same thing can be said with the default setting of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition with the Forgotten Realms. That being said, something that really has never had a generic template, which is essentially World War I, but usually World War II, and there's magic or weird science, and in the wargaming scene, there are two main systems currently: Dust 1947 by Battlefront Miniatures, and Conflict 47 by Warlord Games. Both have their lore, factions, and ups and downs, but only one has zombies. This is the first part of a commission a client had me paint up. The idea with these guys are that they're called the Toten Corps, or the Dead Corps, which are essentially resurrected soldiers and serve as a desperate last line of defense as both meat shields and melee units. There were two factors that really allowed me to play around with how I painted up these guys. The first is simply because this is not a historical setting, which means I do not need to adhere to a quasi-strict guide on how I paint these units, which in all honesty, if you take 10 different historical wargamers and have them paint the same unit, you will get 10 different interpretations. The second is that these models are supposed to be reanimated, and so different states of decay are to be expected. And so instead of a strict uniformity, I can and will experiment with that factor in play. In the lore of the game, what happened is that the US dropped nukes. It created this rift, and so the various factions go and harvest the technology, and by extension every faction would be considered to be Wunderwaffe, but it's actually practical this time around, instead of being a terrible drain on resources that could not reverse the course of the war, even if the wereabouts really wanted to make you believe that it could. Despite this, it is still more grounded in its approach than what 40k usually is, or really ever is, due to this attempting to be a serious attempt at the genre, and not a satirical take on then contemporary cultural and political forces. Or, alternatively with Warhammer Fantasy Battle, it was basically Lord of the Rings with the serial numbers filed off usually. And well, early modern Europe. For the uniforms of the various members of the unit, I decided to go with a regular German field gray by Vallejo, because I like the color, and in all honesty, it feels like it just belongs. Then I put Goblin Green, also by Vallejo, but now it's game color instead of model color, on where the flesh would be, and afterwards splotches of Scorpion Green in order to emphasize the fact that the decay was not uniform and that the technology they are using is not super stable. Besides, simply painting the skin one shade of green would be pretty boring too. The art in the rulebook actually has the skin of these guys, which is essentially a pale bone white with all of the blood drained from their bodies like a pale corpse wandering around the battlefield. At the same time, none of these units get treated exactly the same. Some have more of one type of green, and some get other shades of it as well. I can imagine that this unit was probably cobbled together pretty hastily after an operation gone wrong, but the Germans were still able to maintain the ground and repel the attackers. Their uniforms, despite being riddled with holes, are cleaned to the best of their abilities to show that the commander in charge of them would not tolerate sloppy dress, even if they are undead. The German army in the Second World War did emphasize a great deal of decorum where it was possible. So, for example, in the North African campaign, whenever Rommel took over the Italian forces. The first thing he did was to have them drill properly and actually be a unit instead of being an undisciplined ragtag bunch of soldiers who were thrown at the enemy. Since according to the lore, the Eastern Front is now going from a conflict where there are large-scale operations to ones where there are small firefights popping up here and there. It therefore stands to reason that there would be a significant chunk of time for the German command to actually clean up uniforms to a certain degree. Although, some of the units' webbing is to remain dark and painted black in order to intimidate the enemy while in low light situations, and also to not make them immediately recognizable. Since these are generally mindless beings, there is not an active incentive to have these units all blend in together due to not needing to actually see each other and have that coherency. I paint the webbing mostly black not just because it looks cool, it's also quasi-historically accurate to how they might have worn it as well. Just as a reminder, this is an alternative history game, which means that the Germans, and by extension any other faction, could have taken a different route in their uniform production just due to how the war progressed. The boots were painted cavalry brown because it simply works. Something that you can face when painting even a very simple model like this is decision paralysis, and so during those times it is just better to go with your gut and to stick with the decision you've made. For example, I also painted the suspenders cork brown from the model color line and the helmet's German highlights from the Panzer Aces line. The brown was meant to evoke a sense of contrast between the more drab elements, and the German highlights were simply to be a quick and dirty way to show weathering and that these aren't pristine helmets anymore. It will work when at the tabletop there is no need to go and have some great deal of painting simply for a figure that's meant for playing and not display purposes. What really works to these miniatures' advantage is that it is obvious that they have been lovingly sculpted and not simply churned out for a profit. My biggest complaint with the current GW idea for their monopose models is that they really seem to be made in order to only have the slightest amount of uniqueness possible. You maybe can pose the arms in a different way, but everything else just stays the same. Unless you go and, I don't know, clip the push pins and then glue them and hold them in place, but then that beats the whole purpose of easy to build. Oh well. The thing is though, they do know how to give soul to a monopose model. Just look at the variety of the gene stealers from Space Hulk, where there are around 5 poses, but with the details that gave it some much needed visual variety. While it was just for a board game, you can translate the idea since the Totem Corps are pewter miniatures. They do not have parts that need to be put together, and what you see is what you get. It would be easy for the sculptors to simply decide on 2 or 3 poses, but instead all 8 miniatures are vastly unique. This is a feat in and of itself, not to mention that this is for a spin-off game, which definitely does not bring in the bacon. In fact, the entire game system for Conflict 40 is a passion project. And yes, of course it is driven by some form of profit, but the thing is, otherwise, it would not be feasible to make this into a game. And the other thing though, that in the Modern Games Workshop design philosophy for their bigger games, it really does seem like that they become pretty generic, even whenever it comes to their specialist games as well. Anyways, now we go and we wash some known oil to darken all of the clothing and webbing and whatnot, and to also give it a pretty dirty aesthetic. And as a general rule, black washes give a miniature a colder tone, and brown washes give a warmer tone. And also to remember to shake your pot well before application, otherwise there will be an inconsistent finish across the area applied, and the aesthetic really does get muddled, and not in a good way. It should also be noted that you really don't need to apply the wash more than once. I applied a blue wash to the green skin as well, to have this idea that these are definitely zombies that were raised by some type of weird science. The more I paint, the more I like the idea of these guys coming out of a grindhouse B movie. The final piece of resistance is painting the bullet wounds. Well, to be honest, that is what really ties it all together. It sounds weird to think that this little detail does that much, but it is true. I used 2 different reds. Initially, Gory Red from Vallejo Game Color, but then switched to Flesh Terror's Red from Citadel because it was just a deeper and richer red that sold the feeling of a limb just oozing out blood. I added some Magos Purple on top of it in order to go and give a more infected look. This is definitely rotting skin after all. Again, I am going for a more grungy, dirty look, but at the same time to have it more in the vein of an old B movie. I learned quite a bit from this one job, and honestly, it was simply a nice canvas to work on, mainly because it was something unique in this creative space, something I would not have ever thought that I would voluntarily done, but since I did, it really has opened my eyes to what very intentional sculpts can bring to the table, even if they aren't the most detailed models in the role and haven't been churned out in CAD. It also taught me that maybe, as hobbyists, that we are slaves to the official look of how things look on the box art and promotional image, and instead of allowing ourselves to really interpret the models and paint schemes for ourselves. The problem is often seen in the lens of scale modelers and historical wargamers, but it exists in the minds of those who go to the more fantastic route. But although it does lead to a broader discussion about what it means to really enjoy and have fun versus some arbitrary standard of accuracy for one's miniatures, personally, I believe as long as the aesthetic looks good and everything else matches the tone of the rest of the group, then it's fine. You do not want to have a bunch of super detailed and realistic miniatures along with a unit of ones that look cel-shaded because the coherency of the aesthetic would just be broken. If you want a certain style, then do it, but at the same time, it is all about preference. But you can also criticize other people's choices without demeaning them or saying that yours is inherently better and theirs is inferior. To your average person, the fact that something looks cool is going to be the biggest draw. Actually, there are quite a few topics I will expand upon in later videos, because they deserve their own space to really be talked about. In the end, not only did I enjoy this project, but also it served as a reminder that sometimes the best things in life are the little things.
Before you go, don't forget to please like, comment, and subscribe. Anyways, this is Frontiers Horizon signing off, and until next time, stay frosty.